What's up, everybody? Good evening and good evening and good evening. Thanks for pulling up. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for watching the video. I got mad props for you. Nothing but love. You can see we got some different color going on behind us, which means new series. Future forward. That'll remind you, hey, it's a new series. Anyhow, it's been an interesting week, as it always is. You know how I always like to kick off the live stream with weather reports and news updates and whatever else I feel like talking about. Mostly because I just like stalling and wasting your time. Oh, there's nothing greater than seeing the negative shaking of the head response that I see on my wife's face and body language when I tell stupid dad jokes. Stupid dad jokes. It's even worse when I laugh at them myself, isn't it, honey? Yes. Maybe. Anyways, I know you're probably sick and tired of me talking about the weather, but I got to tell you, the weather today was nuts. Absolutely nuts. We have had hail and sleet and rain and wind. I mean, for crying out loud, it's March. I don't know. I shouldn't complain though. I'm kind of used to it by now, the way that the seasons keep changing. Uh, it's snowed on my birthday before, which is on the 22nd of March. So yeah, 2 weeks. Is it 2 weeks? Wait, let me do my math. 2 weeks from tomorrow. Is that right? 2 weeks from tomorrow. Hi, mommy. Good to see you. Yeah, my birthday's 2 weeks from tomorrow. Wow. And I know that I don't look it, but I'm gonna be 49 years old. Yeah, mommy, we did have some snow actually today. We had quite the spectrum of weather today. And the craziest part about it really is that we started out with beautiful blue sky and sun, and it was like 50 something degrees. And so I was outside for a while, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, this like blackness took over the sky. And then it was like I was telling my wife, it's like somebody flipped the switch and turned on the weather. It was crazy. And it happened like really, really fast. Thank you, mommy. My little baby face that I have. Anyhow, so this week's a special episode. Well, they're all special to me, but this week is especially special because we are starting a brand new series. So I'm pretty excited about that. We got a new intro song. We got a new background color. I did my hair and put on my little professor sweater. But before we kick it off, there's some exciting things happening right now. And I will talk a little bit more about this maybe next week. But starting tomorrow, I begin my final week of seminary. This is kind of crazy. Beginning in 2007, I set out on a journey to obtain for myself a master's in divinity. And along the way, and through many bumps and bruises and different hurdles and such, I have obtained a bachelor's in religion, a master's in theological studies, and will be finishing the end goal. I will be done with all of my assigned requirements next Friday. So that's pretty exciting. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. So we'll talk more about that later, but I just kind of wanted to I was actually someone in my social media, one of my social channels asked me the other day, "Hey, where are you at with your MDiv?" And I thought, I should probably let everybody know what's going on with that. So anyhow, I think that I'm ready to go. Tonight's going to be fun. I hope that you're all strapped in as we begin our new series. So, like always, I trust that you all have poured something delicious for you to sip on. Tonight, for me, it's Johnny Walker Black Label, in case anyone's curious. That's just for me. Anyways, as I was saying, you've poured yourself something very yummy and delicious. Why don't we get rolling on another episode of Real Talk? Welcome to another episode of Real Talk with Heath Brady. I am your host, the theological coordinator. This is the show where everybody really should hang out. Why? Well, we're kind of special here. We talk about the tough stuff, the hard stuff, the difficult stuff, the challenging stuff. You know, we ask a lot of questions here on this program that maybe a lot of people, especially Christians, might be afraid to ask or even answer. But we always want to remind our audience that, as it says in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, that the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and from a good conscience and with a sincere faith. That is our goal. Everything that we say, everything that we do on this program, we want everyone to know who's watching, everyone who's listening, that everything we do here is from a vantage point of love. So tonight is very special. This episode is very special. We're starting a new series this week. This episode, we are starting a new series entitled State of the Steeple. We are going to spend the next several weeks together having a conversation about what is going on in the church right now. What is going on in the realm of Christianity right now? There is a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of it is not so great. And before we get rolling in this series, and I'll probably mention this in every one of the episodes that we do in this series, my goal, as I say, is that our instruction is in love. My goal here, my aim is not to badmouth Christians. My goal, my aim is not to put down the church. My goal here is to love Christians, to love the church, and to have real conversations about real things that the church is really dealing with right now. And I know that that's kind of like opening Pandora's box. There's a lot that we can say. There's a lot of different themes that we can pull. When I say that I want to talk about what's going on with the church and I want to talk about what Christians are dealing with right now, but specifically, especially coming out of our previous series on #blessed and talking about the sanctification process, specifically ending on the note of talking about persecution. And we come into this series talking about the state of the steeple, or the present condition of the church, from various angles. This series is going to then shift us into the next series, which is really going to be powerful. And I don't want to give a lot away about that, but in our next series, we're going to be talking about spiritual abuse, or specifically the things that many of us have endured, gone through, suffered through as Christians, as members of the local church. And again, my goal is not to put down, hurt, or harm the church. My goal is actually to draw attention to what Scripture has to say about the church and compare that to what is the state of the steeple. Specifically, as I always do, we always take a look at what's going on in culture, and we look at Scripture and say, what does Scripture possibly have to say about the condition of the church, the state of the church, and those who would consider or call themselves Christians. And so specifically, we are going to go through a very it's one of my favorite passages. I say this all the time, but it's one of my favorite passages of scripture in all of the Bible. It's probably the passage of scripture that I have specifically studied the most and the longest. It is a passage of scripture that I have literally been studying since I was about 15 or 16 years old. And that is chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. Now, I know you just heard me say Revelation. I want you to know right out of the gate, we are not going to study the entire book of Revelation. That's for another conversation. But chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation are very, very provocative and very, very necessary when it comes to having a conversation about the current state of the church. So we'll be using 7 letters written to 7 churches that were real churches that existed towards the end of the first century. The entire book of Revelation was penned by John somewhere between 93 and 95 AD. So this is roughly 60 years after Christ has ascended. And John is imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, and you can actually go there today. There's churches to visit there. You can actually sit. And someday, this is actually on my bucket list. Someday I would like to go there to the Isle of Patmos. It's off the coast of Turkey. Anyway, John is imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, most likely for preaching the gospel. Most Bible scholars believe and hold the view that the John, the Revelator, John, the man who wrote the book of Revelation, is the same John who was the apostle, the disciple of Jesus Christ. I lean that way. There is certainly evidence to say that this is a different John. But and I'll kind of qualify that remark as we go through, I'll try to qualify that view better as we go through the series. But specifically in John's gospel, the book of John, John describes himself as Christ's beloved or Christ's closest friend. And in Jewish culture, if you called someone your beloved, you told them everything. You shared your deepest, closest personal tidbits about yourself with that person. It was a Jewish term, a specific term reserved for your closest friend, your spouse, and that's pretty much it. And so the book of Revelation as a whole, the Greek word literally means the unveiling. It is the unveiling of Jesus Christ. It's literally everything that has been kept a secret about who Jesus is going to present himself as to the world, all being unveiled. And he's having a personal conversation with John in Revelation and saying, write down everything that I'm about to show you. So that's the main reason why I believe that John the Revelator is the same John. Not John the Baptist. That's a different John. That's Jesus' second cousin, but John the Apostle. So that's just my view, and it is what it is. But the book of Revelation itself is a very interesting book. And so tonight is going to be more or less an introduction to our series. I just felt that there was no way that I could just jump right into the first of the 7 letters without kind of qualifying why these 7 letters are so important and applicable to our conversation. They're very necessary. But the book of Revelation itself it's the only section of scripture it's the only section of all of the Bible that promises a special blessing, same Greek word, a special blessing, happy, fortunate, lucky, to the one who reads and applies what is written. It's there in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3. It says, blessed is the one who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. So the book of Revelation as a whole is a book that has promised this incredible blessing to its reader and the one who applies what they read to their lives. Unfortunately, the book of Revelation, sorry, my microphone's acting weird. Unfortunately, the book of Revelation is the book that is read the least. And it's the only book that promises a special blessing to its reader. And my question is why? Maybe we'll understand why a little bit more as we go through our series. So I want to kind of explain some fundamentals, some ground rules, if you will, as we're going through each of these letters. As I said, Revelation, or the unveiling of Jesus Christ to his church, is actually what the letter is. These two chapters 2 and 3, they deal with what is currently going on. You see, another interesting thing about the book of Revelation is that it gives you somewhat of a divinely inspired outline of the entire book. In chapter 1, verse 19, Jesus tells John to write down everything that he has seen, which is everything that's going on up until verse 19. The things that are, which we're going to discover is chapters 2 and 3, and the things which shall occur after all of that, which is chapter 4, verse 1 on. So we're going to be covering what is currently going on, literally in John's time, and I believe currently what the condition of the church is now. And I think that as we go through each of these letters, you will be shocked at what we uncover as we go through, because it's it's just crazy. Honestly, chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are the most relevant from the entire book of Revelation. Chapters 2 and 3 are the most relevant to us right now. You see, the book of Acts covers roughly the first 30 years of church history. And so by the end of the first century, there was a lot of serious problems in the church. In the first century, from the time of Christ's ascension to the birth of the church, which really is in Acts chapter 2, some 65 years later, the church is already this is what we call the apostolic era. The church is already neck deep in trouble. There's a lot of problems, and there are churches all over the known world at the time, Asia Minor, especially. As I mentioned in my previous episode, Paul has gone on 3 missionary journeys, planting churches all over the place. And so Jesus tells John to write the book of Revelation specifically to 7 particular churches. There's a reason for that. We're going to get into that as we go along. But as I said, by the end of the first century, or the end of the apostolic era, there were some serious problems in the church. And when we go through these letters, there's some very provocative models and templates in each letter. So we're going to focus on these 7 letters, because the focus of these letters really is the unveiling of Jesus to his church. And I can promise everyone who is watching, I can promise everyone who is listening, that we will probably have something to offend everybody. and I don't mean to be funny or crass or flippant, but I'm very certain that there's going to be something about each one of these episodes that bothers somebody. I guarantee it, including myself. One of these letters, every time I read the letter, it just cuts me to the core. So I thought that I would as an introduction to what we're going to do in this series, I thought that I would kind of set the stage for what this is going to look like. In Ephesians chapter 5, written by the Apostle Paul, there's a passage of scripture that a lot of people are very uncomfortable to talk about, especially outside the church, but also inside the church. And that is the section of scripture in Ephesians chapter 5 between verses 22 and 33. And this is kind of known as the marriage section of the New Testament. And this is where you hear the verses where the Apostle Paul tells wives that they are to respect and honor their husbands and let their husbands lead them. And then he also tells husbands that they are to love their wives above everything and everyone else to the point of giving up their very lives for them. It's a very unpopular passage of scripture, especially in 21st century Western culture. But when you see the relationship between the wife respecting her husband and the husband loving his wife, it's very, very beautiful, especially because, and you can also read about this in Colossians chapter 3, by the way, but here in Ephesians 5, the reason why that relationship between husband and wife, as Paul defines here, is so beautiful is because in verse 32 of the same section of scripture, Paul says, this is a great mystery, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and his church. In other words, it's as if Paul is saying, here is the relationship between a husband and wife and how it is supposed to look in God's economy. From God's eternal perspective, a husband is to love his wife unconditionally more than anything or anyone else on this earth, even to the point of giving up his very own life for her. Why? Paul says, because Christ gave his life for his bride, the church. And then Paul says that the wives are to be subject to their husbands, to let their husbands lead them unconditionally, just as they submit to Christ in all things. So this is not a marriage seminar. Trust me, that's not what we're here to talk about. But I wanted to use this passage in Ephesians 5 to kind of set the stage of what we're dealing with here on this series about the state of the steeple. There is a relationship between Christ and the church that is exemplified through the lens of the relationship between husbands and wives. And so essentially, what we're talking about here is that it is obvious that throughout the New Testament, Jesus wants to get a very important message across to his bride, the church. And what is that message? That is what we are going to unpack over the next several weeks together. So I wanted to share a little brief history of my own as far as my personal church experiences. I was born in 1972. I grew up in the Salvation Army Church, and my family, my mom and stepdad, and the oldest of my younger siblings and I grew up attending the Salvation Army Church until I was, I think, roughly in the 5th grade. And this was a church that, and maybe you've heard of the Salvation Army Church outside of the fabulous marching band that they have every parade that you ever see, which my grandparents were both a part of, by the way. They were very much centered on service in the community and in the world. A lot of humanitarian effort. That was their focus. And I can tell you that my entire time growing up in the Salvation Army Church, even though I went to Sunday school, even though I heard all of the same Bible stories that a lot of you have all heard, never once, and I'm not even joking, never once did I ever hear the gospel. Not once. So when I was roughly 5th grade-ish, my family decided that we were going to leave the Salvation Army Church and move over to a Nazarene church. And that's where I attended church through roughly the 9th grade. So about a little bit more than 5 years. Their focus was a very denominational code of ethics. It was not centered on the gospel. When my family became members, we did not, when we had our swearing in, if you will, in the Nazarene church, we did not place our hands on the Bible. We placed our hands on the Nazarene church doctrinal I forget what the book was called, but it's it's a big, huge book. Um, what was ironic though was that they were very liberal in their theology, um, and they had a lot of strange kind of internal practices that they followed, and I won't bore you with all the details of that, but they were very, very legalistic. This was the church that said you can't go dancing, you can't go to movies, stuff like that. Very legalistic, but liberal in their theology and all about their denominational code of conduct. So when I was roughly 13ish years old, we left that church and started going to a Calvary church, which is a non-denominational church. That church is still in existence today. I attended church there until I was about 26 years old. It was in that church that I heard the gospel, and was saved at 14 years old and baptized on the same day. That church was very gospel centered, and they still are, and they're very, very, very focused on discipleship or training up one another in the Christian faith. Very, very healthy church, very, very popular church. There's many of them all over the United States of America. They are non-denominational, but they're all Calvary churches. So anyhow, and then after I was 26, I ended up leaving the Calvary churches, and from that time up until now, I have personally attended various non-denominational churches. Some of them have had foundations in Lutheran church. Some of them have had foundations in Baptist church. But the point is that I kind of bounced around for various reasons. And I'm not going to go into the gory details of that until our next series. But as I said, various non-denominational churches up until the present. My wife and I currently attend a new church, and we love it. Absolutely love it. But, each of those churches that from 26 years old until now, I've had to battle fundamentalism, which is basically the law. That we are under the law, and we have, we have to jump through hoops. It's kind of a religion of works in order to get God to like us. It promotes an atmosphere of, waking up tomorrow in fear because I don't know if God likes me likes me still or hates me because of what I did yesterday. There's bouts with liberalism, which is, or what they call, it's a fancy $25 word from seminary called antinomianism, which is basically the polar opposite of fundamentalism, which is all of life is grace and we're free to do whatever we want to do because we're not under the law anymore. And that's a very, very dangerous situation to be in as well. I've had to battle with what they call Phariseeism, which is kind of like fundamentalism and legalism, but it's more than that. It's like literally coming up with all of these extra hoops that a Christian might have to jump through because they know that they can't keep the law. So they come up with these extra credit things to do in order to find favor with God and with other people, including especially leadership in their churches. So like I said, I've been to many churches. I have seen many different behaviors, and I have endured many, many different troubles. And I can promise you that everything that I have experienced in my short, now almost just about to be 49 years of life, that the spectrum of what is going on in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 has been covered by all of the churches that I personally have attended. Maybe not for you, and I hope not for you. I hope that you have not experienced 1/100th of what I have personally experienced. But it may be the case, and maybe your experience is worse. I don't know. So this series, The State of the Steeple, the condition of the church today, it is described in these 7 letters in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. There are elements of all 7 of these churches in every single church today. Unfortunately, and for those who get this joke, I applaud you. Not every church is like the Church of Philadelphia. Not every church is like the Church of Philadelphia. Every church has got something the matter with it and something not the matter with it. And this conversation is extremely relevant right now, especially because Just like the 7 churches that we are going to talk about, every single church has a misperception of themselves. The churches that think that they're doing terribly are actually doing great. And the churches that think that they're doing great are actually not doing so hot. It may shock you as we go through here. Out of these 7 churches that Jesus is going to address, there are 2 churches that Jesus has nothing bad to say anything about. 2 churches. He has nothing bad to say about them. As well, there are also 2 churches that Jesus has nothing good to say about them. So we're going to discover some very interesting things as we go through. And remember, all of the book of Revelation, not just chapters 2 and 3, were written specifically to these 7 churches. And if you want reference for that, Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 and verses 4 and 11. So some things that are necessary for helping us understand what's going on in each of these letters as a little bit of background. In Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 20, you have John seeing a vision of Jesus beginning to unveil himself. And he says some interesting things. There's a lot of imagery. There's a lot of symbolism throughout the book of Revelation, which I believe is probably the number one reason why a lot of people don't read it and study it. But in chapter 12, John, it says, I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man. That's Jesus. So John turns and sees Jesus, clothed in a robe reaching to his feet. And he goes on to explain all of these different descriptors of what Jesus looked like. In verse 16, it says that in his right hand, in Jesus' right hand, he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. Some more descriptions. And then in verse 20, Jesus tells John what all these images are. The mystery of the 7 stars, the mystery of the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And then one other thing that I want to point out is that Jesus walks in the midst of the lampstands. And we'll discover that we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later episode. So you've got these golden lampstands that Jesus walks in the middle of, and those lampstands in the imagery, those lampstands are these 7 specific churches. And then the stars that he's holding in his right hand, those are the angels of the 7 churches. And as I always say, I don't like to make everybody feel like we're in seminary, but that word there for angel is an important word to unpack for just a second. It's the Greek word angelos, and most often it just simply means messenger. Sometimes it does actually mean an angel of supernatural proportions, but the vast majority of the time, it simply means messenger. So these messengers, these angels of these 7 churches, they could be the pastors of these specific churches. That's the direction that I tend to lean in personally. So Jesus is giving this imagery to John that he is walking in the midst of the churches. And we know that Jesus is God. It says all over Scripture that Jesus is God, and God is omnipresent, which means he's everywhere all of the time. So we have this imagery that Jesus, in his deity, is in the midst of all of these churches. And that's awesome, and it's frightening at the same time. Because guess what? By extension, the same is true today. Jesus is in the midst of all of our churches, whether we want to hear that or not. There's one church, though, that we're going to get into in a later episode, where he's actually outside of the church waiting to be let in. That's a real thing that's going on today as well. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So here you have Jesus describing himself as the one who walks in the midst of the lampstands, and he holds the messengers in his right hand. And the right hand is a place of power. It's a place of authority. So, in other words, the authority that these pastors have in their churches is given to them by Jesus Christ, and by extension can also be taken away. We'll unpack that a little bit more as we go. So he's, as I said, this is explained there in verse 20. So each one of these letters, as we go through them, you're going to discover some interesting things. In each of these letters, there's going to be a theme. Everything about the letter has a theme. What Jesus says about the church, even the very name of the church, pertains to the theme of the letter. Jesus will choose a title for himself in every letter that also pertains to that theme. He will have a promise to at least 5 of the churches to the overcomer. He will be giving a report card to each of these churches. There will be a commendation and a correction. There's these quotes, "I know," which is exciting and also scary. "I know your deeds. I know your condition." Jesus knows. Again, he walks in the midst of the churches, so he knows what's going on. You can't hide anything from Jesus. He's God, remember? In every single one of these letters, there's also going to be a conditional statement. If you do such and such, then I will do such and such. But if you don't, then this is going to happen. And then there's this crazy provocative statement in every single letter. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So why go through these letters? Well, as I said, I believe that Jesus wants his bride, the church, to know that he loves her so much and that he's watching her very closely. And he wants her to really understand what he wants for her. And I just find that is so in God's character, that the lengths that God goes to get a message to his people, that he would even go so far as to become one of us. That's the person of Jesus Christ. And live a life that we could not live, and die a death that we could not die, to pay a penalty that we could not afford on our behalf. That is, after all, the message of the gospel. So I believe that these letters are extremely crucial for us today. For one, these letters were written to 7 literal churches. And as I said, the entire book of Revelation was written to a copy was sent to all 7 churches, which means that the report cards that each church got, the other churches saw the same report card. So everybody knew what was going on with everybody. Like major exposure here. The good, the bad, the ugly, for everybody. So I believe, like I said, on one level, these letters were written to 7 literal churches. I believe that these letters were written to all churches of all time. That sounds a little sensational, but that phrase, hear what the Spirit says to the churches, it's plural. I believe that's to all churches of all time. Especially as we go through these letters, you will see the circumstances of these letters, and you might think for yourself, man, this sounds a whole lot like this church that I went to, or this church that I grew up, or this church I grew up in, or this sounds like an experience that I went through. It's shocking. And I'm going to qualify that view here in a second. And thirdly, I believe that whether you're in the church or not, whether you're a part of the church or not, whether you're a Christian or not, that these 7 letters were written to you and I personally, you and me personally. Why? He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Last I checked, every one of us has got at least one ear. So Jesus says to John, write this down. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So these 7 letters are for literal churches, they are for all churches, and they are for everybody else. Nobody gets a free pass here. So we better listen up to what Jesus is trying to say here, what he's trying to get accomplished here. But what's interesting is that these messages, these themes, this message that Jesus, I believe, is trying to get across to his church, is not just present in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. Is it possible that there are other letters to other churches in the Bible that deal with themes like being unfaithful to the Lord, or loving their brothers unconditionally, or maybe the theme of keeping Jesus on the outside? Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. Well, let me give you a little hint. There are 7 other letters written to churches in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul: Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. And it will come as a shock to you that every single one of these themes that are present in the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, they are also very much present in the 7 letters that Paul wrote in his epistles in the New Testament. Now, we're not going to go through those books of the Bible, and you're more or less going to have to take my word for it, but read those books: Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. You will see as we go through. I might even lead you a little. Go check out what Paul said to this church and compare it to what Jesus is saying to this church in Revelation. It's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. There's so much, though, that is causing trouble for the church. But the scary thing is that most of it is her own doing. A lot of the problems, a lot of the stresses, a lot of the trials and tribulations that are going on in Christianity, a lot of it is our own fault. It's the church's own fault. And so we're going to look at certain issues in the church today, and we're going to compare those issues to what's going on in the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3. And most of all, we're going to see what the biblical prescription is for course correcting, because Jesus is going to tell every single one of these churches the real condition of what they look like, regardless of what they think they might look like, and how to overcome that, or how to endure suffering. You see, Jesus went so far as to die on a cross of wood to save sinners and bring them into his church. They are his bride. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are a Christian, you are part of the church. You are a part of the bride of Christ. And the book of Revelation, later on in the book of Revelation, it talks about the wedding feast in heaven, where Christ is finally together with his bride. But just as Jesus is a gentleman who would never force anyone to love or follow him, he's also just as much a gentleman in that he warns those who do follow him what the results look like when we don't let him lead us. So I am excited about this journey that we're going to take. It's going to be fun. It's going to be tough. It's going to hurt a little, but it's very, very necessary. And so, as I said, Jesus is the ultimate gentleman. He will not force you to love or follow him, and he will warn those of us who do follow him what the results look like when we don't let him lead us. And that is all I have to say about that. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk. We are here every Sunday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Please, please, please follow me on all of the socials. Real Talk with Heath Brady on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Real Talk is also a podcast. You can listen to me. You can listen to every one of these episodes either on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, really anywhere that you get your podcasts from. So please, whether you watch the videos, please, when you listen to the podcast, make sure, tell a friend to tell a friend everything that we are doing here. And remember, above all things, that the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. Thanks so much again for tuning in. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. This is going to be a great series. I can't wait to get rolling in our next episode. But until then, this is the theological coordinator saying, peace.